point of
Under anesthesia, you can't do anything. Okay. Again, I think heparin is only, it will prevent only venous thrombosis. It is not an arterial thrombosis is predominantly platelet induced. Okay. So heparin is predominantly an anticoagulant which acts predominantly in the veins, right? So you have to start antiplatelets. But under surgery, you can't start that. So what you have to do is try to do the supply match demand. If it is working out, if it's a dire emergency surgery, take the risk and do, and immediate post-operatively take the patient to cath lab and do a stenting, right? And do a coronary angiogram. Make sure if there is any atherosclerosis, you can do a percutaneous stenting. But in case
Is
if
there
they
any role of antiplatelets starting immediately?
immediately start depends upon the type of surgery you're operating. Okay, antiplatelets, because again I'm telling, this is not because of thrombus. Introp ischemia are not because of thrombus or atherosclerosis. It is mainly because of the supply demand mismatch. Okay, at that time giving antiplatelet doesn't make any difference at all. Antiplatelets will work only when there is a clot. Okay, you are giving them to prevent the clot formation. Whereas the problem under anesthesia is not the clot formation, it's mainly because of the supply demand mismatch ratio. Like hypertensive patients, they'll have left ventricular hypertrophy. So when they're hypertrophy under normal state, they might be quite normal. But when the stress of anesthesia, when there is a tachycardia, when there is low diastolic filling time, the entire muscles might not get an adequate blood supply. So that is the reason for ischemic changes. So in that case, what is the point in going and doing an antiplatelet and putting a stent? No use at all.
Role of NTG under anesthesia.
Yes, NTG, right? As I said, you can reduce afterload. I said you can give vasodilators. So NTG can be given.
Okay.
okay.
Okay, moving on to the next one. Right, who wants to take up this station? Come very fast.
I would like to volunteer, sir.
Yes, please. So this is a patient in the ward on second post-operative day following abdominal hysterectomy. So a code blue is announced. By the time you reach, a nurse is doing a CPR in process. Monitors are attached, right? Before that, what is the first step you do when you arrive at the scene? The CPR is led by nurse there.
Take over, sir. Take over the CPR.
No.
Scene safety.
Sir, check for pulse.
Okay, so
Check for
first
pulse.
confirm there is a cardiac arrest. Okay, so confirmation by checking airway, breathing and the circulation at the same time. Check the pulse and the breathing at the same time. So that is the first thing you have to do when you arrive at the scene of cardiac arrest. Okay, confirm there is a cardiac arrest. Okay, good. Where is the pulse you look for in adults?
The carotid pulse, one side.
Okay, in pediatrics?
Achial artery pulse.
Femoral, femoral.
In pediatrics, it is brachial.
Brachial.
In neonates, it is femoral. Okay, so these are the locations to check for the pulsations in different age groups. Right, so you got a rhythm here. Identify this rhythm.
So this is ventricular tachycardia, sir.
Monomorphic pulseless ventricular tachycardia. Okay, that's full thing. Every word has got a meaning. Polymorphic is going to be a different treatment. Pulse VT is going to be a different treatment. All right, so it's a monomorphic pulseless ventricular tachycardia. Right, what is the next step in your management?
So see the hemodynamic stability, sir.
What is the point? Patient is in cardiac arrest.
Defibrillator.
Defibrillation.
Rest all,
shockable
please
rhythm,
be
sir.
quiet. For God's sake, please be quiet. Right. So
So
what is the
it's a
next step in the
shockable- It's a shockable rhythm, sir.
Okay,
So I'll
very
go
good.
for
So you're going to plan for
defibrillation. sir.
defibrillation. Very good. Okay. So the moment you see ventricular fibrillation, CPR is ongoing. The first step is immediately defibrillation, because as early as defibrillation, the outcome is going to be extremely good. What type of defibrillator type you use? Monophasic or biphasic?
Biphasic, sir.
Okay, you're going to give
120
biphasic defibrillation. And what is the energy?
I will start with 120 joules, sir.
There is nothing called 120 joules, straight away 200. When it comes to defibrillation, no starting with low energy. Okay, straight away with
Yes, sir.
200 joules biphasic shock. Good.
Yes, sir.
Shock has been given. What do you do? The next immediate step?
Check for pulse and rhythm, sir.
Certainly wrong. Okay,
Yes,
the
sir.
moment you give
CPR.
defibrillation, start CPR again. Okay, 100% completely wrong. Right? When you say check for pulse, you'll get a wrong answer. So the moment CPR, when shock is delivered, Don't check pulse, don't check rhythm. Immediately do start receiving the CPR. Okay, how long you continue the CPR?
2 minutes, sir.
2 minutes, okay. So you have to check the rhythm and the pulse. You have to wait for 2 minutes, okay? Continue the cycle of CPR. You can stop only when the patient is making an active movement, okay? When the patient is making an active breathing, only then you can stop in the middle. Otherwise, after defibrillation, continue CPR for 2 minutes. At the end of 2 minutes, you're again seeing the same rhythm. What do you do?
I'll again shock, sir.
Okay, you're gonna give second shock, right? How much energy?
I'll increase the energy, sir. From
Biphasic
2 to
maximum you can give is only 200, all right? So
Yes, sir.
again, 200 joules biphasic. Right, if it is a monophasic, how much energy you can give?
360, sir. I'll do.
360, okay? Okay, so biphasic shock is given, CPR is continued. 2 minutes again, you're checking the rhythm. Again, it is the same rhythm. What do you do?
Third time again shock I'll give, sir.
Okay, you're gonna give third shock, right? In addition to that, what else you should do?
300 milligram.
I'll keep.
Sir, sorry to interrupt, sir, but new ACLS says adrenaline, sir, after second shock.
I think it's new ACLS says even adrenaline only after the third shock, I think. Are you sure?
No.
It is
Second
given.
shock adrenaline.
Okay, new adrenaline. Adrenaline
No,
is it?
sir, after the
After
second
third
shock,
shock,
sir.
amiodarone is to be started.
I mean, what the thing is, the question is, let's clarify, is adrenaline is given after the second shock? Are you sure?
Second shock, sir.
Yes,
sir. Second shock.
Okay, fine. I think I just got confused. I thought it's given in the third shock. Right. Okay, then one shot. If everyone are telling
Sir,
that,
that was in 2015, sir. You were right,
but
sir.
even
but-
even in 2020, I think it is. I thought it's in the third one. Okay, fine. If it is that in the second shock, right? Okay, let's give one dose of adrenaline. 2 minutes over. Now you are giving the third shock. Okay, what is next there?
Then amiodarone, sir.
Amiodarone. How much amiodarone?
Amiodarone, I'll give 300 mg bolus, sir.
If amiodarone is not there, what alternative you can give?
Adenosine. I'll give.
Lignogen, sir.
Adenosine. Oh my goodness, no.
Lidocaine.
Please,
Lignogen.
others, please be quiet, please. Please be quiet. You can interrupt at the end of the station. Others, please be quiet. Put your mics on mute. Right. So 300 milligram amiodarone. If it is not there, alternatively, you can give lidocaine. Okay, good. What are the two shockable rhythms, doc? What are the two shockable rhythms? Unmute and tell me, doc.
So one is ventricular fibrillation. The
Okay,
other
VF,
is pulseless VT, sir.
Pulseless VT. Very good. So these are the only two shockable rhythms. Can you tell me few reversible causes for cardiac
Yes, so
arrest?
5H and 5T, sir.
Okay, 5H
So
and 5Ts.
Hypovolemia, hypoxia,
Okay,
hydrogen ions or acidosis,
okay,
then hypothermia and
Okay.
hypo or hyperkalemia. 5H.
perfect.
And 5T, sir, any cardiac tamponade,
Okay,
then tension pneumothorax,
okay,
thrombosis,
okay,
pulmonary or coronary, and
okay,
toxins.
perfect. All right, now tell me, what are the factors which can affect the success of defibrillation?
The proper positioning and
Positioning of
proper
what?
of the pedal, sir.
Okay, positioning of the paddle. Okay, there are two factors basically. One is going to be the energy, other is going to be the transthoracic resistance. Okay, so high energy biphasic, there is a good chance that you get a successful defibrillation and early defibrillation, right?
Yes.
Transthoracic resistance is affected by multiple factors. As the first thing you told, the contact between the paddles and the skin. Okay, so you have to apply an adequate pressure, right? You have to apply an adequate pressure such that you get a good contact. Second factor which is going to affect the transthoracic resistance is the size of the paddles. You should use minimum 8 to 10 centimeter paddle size for an adult. Okay, then the direction of the current. Okay, anteroposterior direction. If you keep the paddles anterior and posterior, chance of defibrillation is very good. Okay, then the phase of respiration. Expiration, it got a more successful chance than in a patient with inspiration, particularly if you're cardioverting the patient. Okay, and lastly, the resistance between the skin. Removing all the air pockets and removing the hair between the paddles and the skin can have a better chance of defibrillation, because air air pockets and the hair can dissipate the current so that adequate amount of energy is not going to reach the heart. So these are the factors which can affect the success of defibrillation.
Yes, sir.
Good. So again, late defibrillation because of the prolonged acidosis, it might not give you a good result. So early defibrillation, good amount of energy, high energy at the initial shock and biphasic shock preferably.
So then at what, sir, could you please repeat the algorithm when we are giving the adrenaline after second one or the
I think
third one? Sir?
it's every, as per everyone's information, it is by the after the second dose.
Okay, sir.
Good. I'll go and recheck it back today. No problem.
Sir, what are the alternatives for amiodarone, sir?
You can use lidocaine.
Sir, please biphasic and monophasic differences briefly.
Biphasic and monophasic differences. Okay. In biphasic, okay, current is going to travel in both directions. In monophasic, it is going to travel only in one direction. Okay. Myocardial damage is very less in biphasic shock. Myocardial damage is going to be very high in monophasic shock. These are the major differences.
So what will be the position of the pads?
So yeah, there are different anteroposterior, anterolateral, lateral, multiple approaches there. Commonly used is one probe, one paddle below the clavicle and one paddle in the axillary mid-axillary line. Okay, this is anterolateral. But anteroposterior, if possible, that has got a best chance of defibrillating the patient.
Okay, sir.
So, sir, one more point, like if it is a shockable rhythm, still we should continue CPR for 30
Okay,
minutes.
so
ideal.
if it is a shockable rhythm, okay, if the machine is ready, charged, you straight away give the shock as soon as possible. But in case the machine is not ready, it's going to get plugged in, it's going to take time to ready, then you have to continue CPR. The main CPR is going to be the primary focus. Okay. If there is a time delay, continue CPR until you get the machine ready.
Okay, sir. So we should not
Cardiac-
terminate according to rhythm, like early termination of
See, the
resuscitation.
thing is, you should understand what situation you're facing in, right? CPR should be the primary focus because your main concentration is to make the brain perfusion continuously. Okay, don't interrupt the brain perfusion. If the machine is ready, okay, I mean, having a cardiac arrest in theater setup is different. Having a cardiac arrest in ward setup is different, isn't it? So in theaters, you'll have a ready accessibility to the defibrillator. You can defibrillate immediately. Whereas the situation is going to be extremely difficult in the ward. In that cases, until someone goes and gets the defibrillator, continue the CPR.
Okay, sir.
Sir, definition and value of cardiac compression fraction, sir.
I don't know. Right.
So this new ACLS, they have put this term, sir, cardiac compression. Chest compression fraction.
Chest compression fraction.
ECF, sir.
Yeah, I heard that in the new guideline. Fine, I'll find it and tell it to you. No problem. I heard that, but I forgot. I'll let you know in the group. No worries.
Sir, it is the number of chest compressions given during the total resuscitation duration. So it should be more than 80.
Okay, good. You got the answer there. Thank you, Rob.
Sir, paddle size in pediatrics, sir, area wise?
Pediatric, I think it should be your size of your fist, an adult fist, right?
Okay, sir, thank you.
Right. Who wants to take up this station?
So, one doubt, sir.
Yeah.
So, what is difference between cardioversion and defibrillation? Like,
Okay, so cardioversion, cardioversion is a synchronized, which means the current will be getting delivered only at the peak of the R wave. Okay, so you are making the machine to find where is the R wave, and your machine is going to deliver the shock only when there is synchronized with the R wave or the QRS complex. Why? Because in the R wave, in the initial part of R wave, the heart is in the absolute refractory period. Okay, absolute refractory period means whatever amount of stimulus you give, you can't stimulate the heart. Okay, there are two refractory periods basically, right? So this is a baseline. If you see the action potential, you got the phase 0 here, then the phase 1, then the plateau phase, then the phase 3 repolarization phase. Until the initial half of the plateau phase, right? It is called as an absolute refractory period. Later part of the plateau phase, we call them as a relative refractory period. So in absolute refractory period, whatever any extra bit of stimulus cannot stimulate the heart again. Whereas any supramaximal stimulus reaching the heart during the relative refractory period can precipitate a further stimulus. Okay. So in synchronized cardioversion, the mission is make sure such a way that it deliver the current synchronizing with the R wave. So the QRS complex, the R wave QRS complex predominantly happens in the absolute refractory period. It is the SG segment and T wave normally happens in the relative refractory period, right? So if you give a shock in this segment, what happens, the heart will again get stimulated and it will go for ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia. So you are synchronizing the machine in such a way that it deliver the shock in coordination with the R wave or the QRS complex. That is what meaning by synchronized. Unsynchronized is defibrillation, irrespective of whatever phase it will give a huge amount of energy.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sir, is pacing also done with R wave?
Sorry?
Pacing is done with R wave, sir, in bradyarrhythmia?
In bradyarrhythmia, it depends upon whether you're going to give a transcutaneous pacing or transvenous pacing, and you're going to pace the atrium or the ventricle, depending upon what sort of rhythm you're getting.
Okay, sir.
Good. Who wants to take up this one? There is a light. Good. Yeah. So what is this patient? This patient is a 40 years old female coming for an elective umbilical hernia repair. She is a post-cardiac transplant, cardiac transplantation done for a cardiomyopathy 3 years back. She's currently on cyclosporine, azathioprine, steroids, and immunoglobulin. X-ray tolerance is good. She's not on any pacemakers, and she's an hypertensive on treatment. What is the normal baseline heart rate in transplant patients?
It will be 100 to 200, sir, because there is no vagal stimuli.
100 to 200.
It will be higher than the normal.
Okay, what is the heart rate normal range of the transplanted heart? It is going to be 90 to 110. Okay, so that is the normal baseline heart of the transplanted heart. Why it is on the higher range?
Because there is no vagal, denervated heart, so there is no vagal stimuli.
Okay, but still sympathetic nervous system is also lost, right? But why still heart rate is on the higher side? Of course, vagal is not there, but sympathetic system is also not there.
It has adrenoreceptors. But
yes, good. It is basically has got the sympathetic receptors, which will respond to the circulating catecholamines in the body, right? Very good. So that's why you get a higher baseline heart. Their normal heart rate is going to be 90 to 110 beats per minute. Okay. What is most important factor affecting the cardiac output in this type of patients?
Preload is the major determinant.
Okay. So what are the factors affecting the cardiac output?
Preload, heart rate.
Okay. Okay, so heart rate, cardiac output is given by heart rate multiplied by stroke volume, of which stroke volume is affected by preload, afterload, and cardiac output. Contractility. Heart rate is affected by sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Transplanted heart, no use, no use. Okay. Transplanted heart, no use. There is no any reflex vasoconstriction. No use of this one because it depends upon only the intrinsic myocardial contraction, not respond to extrinsic contraction. So this becomes the major factor affecting the cardiac output. So in transplanted heart, there is no sympathetic supply, no parasympathetic supply, which means whereas the intrinsic Frank-Starling's mechanism, which means when there is a stretch, there is going to be more contraction. That is what Frank-Starling's mechanism is. So that intrinsic mechanism of the myocardial muscle is intact. So if you want to maintain adequate cardiac output, make sure the patient is adequately filled. Never under deplete the patient. Even if the patient is hypovolemic, you can't find because the clinical signs of hypovolemic shock like tachycardia, reflex hypotension, reflex tachycardia is everything is lacking. So always maintain adequate preload. So that is going to be the major determinant of the cardiac output. What are the clinical features of graft rejection?
There will be alteration in heart rate, but there won't be any other.
Okay, unexplained tachycardia. Okay, weight gain, edema, ankle edema predominantly, and features of LV failure. Okay, then intractable arrhythmias. So these are the signs of clinical features and signs of graft rejection. Okay, so when the patient is coming for pre-anesthetic assessment, you have to ask all these things: whether any recent weight gain, any edema, any decreased urine output, tiredness, extreme tiredness, poor exercise tolerance, and frequent episodes of ventricular arrhythmias are all signs of graft rejection. What is your
main graft rejection in other organs also, sir, like liver, kidney?
I mean, it can happen. I mean, we are specifically talking about the heart rejection. Okay, each organ rejection has got its own signs and symptoms.
Okay, sir.
Okay, like for example, if there is liver rejection, you're going to have an acute rise in liver function test. Like each organ has got its own clinical features. For specifically for heart transplant recipient rejection, they will have unexplained weight gain, edema all over the body, intractable ventricular arrhythmias, then myocardial ischemia. The problem with the myocardial ischemia is they don't have any chest pain at all because there is no any sensing element for their myocardial ischemia.
Okay, sir.
Good. What are the vital pre-anesthetic concerns, Doc?
Universal precautions because they are more prone for infections.
First thing, very good. Okay, they are more likely to have infections because of the huge loads of immunosuppressants. Their immunity is suppressed, so they have a silent infection all over the body. And most important thing, the classical features of infection like fever, shivering, tachycardia, leukocytosis, everything is absent because of the immunosuppression. Right. Second thing.
And
Then,
because of the drugs they are taking, there will be a lot of drug interactions.
Okay, because of the drugs they take. So this cyclosporin, other heparin, they can cause hypertension, they can cause hyperkalemia, they can cause pancreatitis, cholelithiasis, renal failure, multiple problems because of the immunosuppressant agents they take. Very good. Then
because steroid induced bone that will be
okay, all drug induced, all steroid induced problems. Fine. Then signs of rejection, which we discussed already. Then lastly, coronary allograft vasculopathy. So this is also again another sign of rejection. Okay, it's a sign of chronic rejection. In 10 to 15%, it develops within 1 or 2 years. In 50 to 70%, it develops after 5 to 7 years. So slowly, what happens? This coronary vessel, the heart of the native coronary vessels, will go for intimal hypertrophy and slowly result in coronary allograft vasculopathies, and they tend to have ischemia. As I said, in myocardial ischemia, in transplant patients, they don't have the typical signs of chest pain, which we normally see in normal patients. Good. These are the major concerns: infection, rejection, drug-induced effect, and coronary allograft vasculopathy. What are the important class of antihypertensives which has to be specifically avoided in this group of patients? Which group of antihypertensives should not be used to treat a patient?
Both mixed alpha and beta blockers.
Why?
Which has
It is beta blockers, right? Beta blockers are generally not used to treat hypertension in this patient because the patient's sympathetic drive predominantly depends upon the circulating catecholamines. Okay, so when you block the circulating catecholamines, the catecholamines will not go and stimulate the sympathetic receptors. The patient will have a very, very severe bradycardia. Okay, so beta blockers are generally avoided for the purpose of antihypertensive in this group of patients. Okay, now you have anesthetized the patients. Generally, you can try different sorts of anesthesia, GA, regional, block, everything. But the preferred technique is going to be general anesthesia in most of the patients, mainly because the hypertension secondary to spinal, all the reflex features are absent. So that is why it is advisable in major of the studies to go under general anesthesia. Right. So we have anesthetized a patient during the intraoperative period. You see that patient is having severe bradycardia of heart rate 30 per minute. What is your management?
give epinephrine.
Okay, epinephrine, more than epinephrine, any other important drug?
Phenylephrine.
Isoprenaline.
Patient is having bradycardia. Will you give phenylephrine? Phenylephrine is a vasopressor, right?
Isoprenaline.
Okay, isoprenaline is an ideal drug of choice, right? So isoprenaline can be given, dobutamine can be given, epinephrine can be given. So isoprenaline will be the first choice because it predominantly acts in the beta 1 and beta 2 receptors. So that will be the first drug choice. Don't give us acetylcholine. All parasympathetic drugs will not work, right? All parasympathetic lytics like atropine, neostigmine will not work in this patient. Similarly, sympathetic reflex like carotid sinus massage, Valsalva maneuver, intubation response, laryngoscopic response are completely absent in this type of patients because of the denervated heart. Good. Any questions here?
Sir, does pacing work in these kind of patients?
Okay, so generally these patients tend to have incidence of heart degree block, primary first degree heart block, and development of conduction blocks and other blocks are very common. Generally happens after 1 or 2 years or within 6 months. So most of the patients will be put on pacemakers.
So it's prophylactically like they are on pacemaker.
It is not all patients doesn't need pacemakers. Some patients, they definitely need pacemakers because of the development of this first degree heart block and conduction delays at later stages.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good. Let's move on to the next station. Read a question. Who want to volunteer? Come and start.
Sir, may I volunteer?
Yes, please.
Sir, this appears to be myasthenia gravis.
Okay, this appears to be myasthenia gravis. What is the clinching point towards myasthenia gravis?
Sir, ptosis and difficulty in swallowing. Sir.
Okay, so many conditions can cause ptosis and difficulty in breathing, isn't it? Why specifically this patient is myasthenia gravis?
Fatigability, sir. Heavy
Yes,
work.
while doing heavy work. Okay, so when you do excessive work, all your acetylcholine stores are exhausted. So that is the reason you get difficulty in breathing, bulbar symptoms, diplopia, specifically after doing heavy work. Good. What is the medical management of this condition?
Sir, non-pharmacological rest and then pharmacological.
Okay, fine. What is the pharmacological treatment?
Neostigmine or pyridostigmine.
Okay, anticholinesterase predominantly.
Anticholinesterase.
Anticholinesterase, pyridostigmine is most preferred, right? Then you can give neostigmine, oral pyridostigmine and neostigmine. Good. Then what are the treatments?
Steroids.
Steroids, okay. Steroids to suppress the immune system. Then immunoglobulins, right? Immunoglobulins. Rest all, please be quiet. Immunoglobulins and to remove the antibodies, plasma pheresis. Okay, so these are the then anti-cancer drugs like mycophenolate and so many anti-neoplastic.
Azathioprine.
Yeah. So what is the main pathology behind myasthenia gravis? Doc?
Sir, there is early metabolism of acetylcholine and neuromuscular junction.
Early metabolism of
Like
acetylcholine.
rapid metabolism.
No.
Non-availability of acetylcholine in
Why there is a non-availability? That is the question.
Sir, antibody against acetylcholine.
Others, please be quiet, please, so that everyone can listen. Why there is no receptors?
Sir, antibody-mediated destruction of acetylcholine at end plate.
Yes, okay. There is a generation of autoantibodies which comes and completely destroys this acetylcholine receptors. Okay, so this is damage. This is damage. So even though the acetylcholine release is normal, since there is no receptors, you get weakness when you do an heavy work. Perfect. What are the predictors of poor post-operative outcome?
Sir, how many attacks of this myasthenic crisis have happened in recent past?
No worries. It's not that one. Okay.
Duration of illness.
Duration of disease more than 6 years, right?
And dose of pyridostigmine more than 700.
Pyridostigmine dose more than 750 milligram per day. Third thing, when the forced vital capacity in your pulmonary function test is less than 2.9 liters. Okay. And the last one, presence of COPD. So these are the 4 factors which will tell the patient is likely to have post-operative ventilation. There is a scoring system. Don't worry about the scoring system. So these 4 factors, if you could remember, that is fine. Duration of the disease more than 6 years. When the patient's daily dose intake is more than 750 milligrams per day, which clearly tells that the patient is having a severe disease. When the forced vital capacity is less than 2.9 liters, or when the patient is having a known case of COPD. So these all indicates that patient is likely to have post-operative ventilation. Very good. What are the drugs which can exaggerate this condition?
Sir, magnesium sulfate.
Okay, magnesium. Excellent. Antibiotics. Antibiotics predominantly. Okay.
Sir, metronidazole.
Fluoroquinolones, aminoglycosides, okay, fluoroquinolones and macrolides. All these 3 groups of drugs predominantly affect precipitated myasthenia. Magnesium.
Sir, in which order, sir? Like which are more prone? Antibiotics?
It's not like there any antibiotics of this group, right? Never worry about the order.
Okay.
Right. Then all antiarrhythmics like procainamide, quinidine, all these drugs, a huge set of drugs is there. So antibiotics, magnesium, procainamide, quinidine, and majority of antiarrhythmic drugs and IV local anesthetics, right? That can cause predominant, exaggerate this myasthenia gravis condition. What are the drugs which has to be used cautiously under anesthesia?
So muscle relaxants, basically.
Okay. Muscle
Delayed
relaxant.
recovery. Delayed
fine.
recovery from muscle relaxant.
One interesting muscle relaxant question, right? So this patient,
Non-depolarizing.
wait a minute. Okay, this patient is, let's assume that he is 60 kilogram. Okay, what will be the dose of succinyl choline for this patient? Rest all, please. Absolute silence, please.
Sir, it will be on the higher side. We can go up to 2.5 to 3 milligrams.
Why it is on the higher side?
Sir, because of rapid metabolism of less availability of acetylcholine at the junction.
See, when you give succinyl choline, there will be a lot of acetylcholine available now.
Yes, sir. Due to but antibodies on the motor end plate, they will destruct
No.
it more rapidly.
No. Why succinyl choline dose is very high? Patient will require a very high dose of succinyl choline.
Receptors are less, sir.
Sir, don't know.
So it
Okay,
requires
very
prolonged-
good, right? Very good. Okay. For succinyl choline to produce muscle relaxation, you need a good number of functional receptors. Okay, because succinyl choline produces relaxation because of it produces fasciculation and prolongs the depolarization time. So that is why you get a relaxation. So which means you need a large number of functional receptors to work. Then only succinyl choline will produce relaxation. So in that case, when the number of functional receptors are less, you have to give more and more dose of succinyl choline so that it acts continuously for quite long time, and then only you get relaxation. So succinyl choline will be highly resistant. The myasthenia gravis patients will have very, very high resistance to succinyl choline. That is why you have to give very high dose because of the low number of functional receptors. Whereas non-depolarizing, it is exactly opposite. They'll be very sensitive. So depolarizing, very resistant. Non-depolarizing, very sensitive. Just 10 to 20% of the conventional dose is enough. Always give the drug in presence of neuromuscular monitoring. Okay.
Okay. Sir, why
Up-
less for non-depolarizing? Like any?
Non-depolarizing, it is a competitive blocker, isn't it? So, okay, when already there is less number of receptors, what happens? It can block easily.
Yes. So high dose, like, and in what range, sir? High dose of depolarizing.
Just when apart from the conventional dose, just 10 to 20% of the conventional. If giving 10 milligram, just 1 to 2 milligram is enough in this type of patients.
No, sir. In deep, like scoline, like higher dose.
It's choline again. They need a higher dose, but exactly difficult to tell how much dose they need.
Okay.
Because
Higher
you
than
know,
normal.
Higher
Yes.
than normal. Generally, they'll be
Yes.
very resistant, so you need higher than normal.
Yes.
Good. So other drugs which has to be used cautiously. One is muscle relaxants. Fine. Then
Sir,
sedatives.
antimetabolites or immunosuppressants.
Sedatives, right? All sedatives. These
Sedatives,
patients
yes.
are very sensitive to sedative drugs. So
Respiratory,
sedatives has to be used very
depression.
carefully. That can produce respiratory depression. So sedatives and muscle relaxant has to be used very carefully. Majority of the patient you can do just volatile induction and intimate even without muscle relaxing.
Okay.
Okay, good. Any questions here?
Sir, plasma
Sir.
pheresis ideally when should be done in elective case?
Ideal plasma surgery can be done when you're doing an emergency surgery to wash away as much as antibiotics away from the body.
And any hemodialysis affects these things, sir, like antibody?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Sir, what about anticholinergic drugs?
Okay, so anticholinergic drugs, specifically like neostigmine. Neostigmine, what happens when you give a neostigmine? What is the effect of neostigmine? It is an anticholinesterase. So when you give neostigmine, it can paradoxically improve the functions in patients with myasthenia gravis because neostigmine, by producing acetylcholinesterase inhibition, it increases the amount of acetylcholine availability. So it produces a clinical improvement in this type of patients.
So, sir, in reversal, the reversal dose remains same, sir.
Reversal dose will remain same predominantly. Okay. In fact, you can use even a lesser dose. That all depends upon your neuromuscular response. So you can use a neuromuscular monitoring, and then you can gauge what is the amount of neostigmine you can give. Because these patients, when they have a neostigmine excessive dose, what happens is there will be high amount of acetylcholine, and that can produce anticholinergic effects like increasing the secretions. All the muscarinic effects will be there. So in order to avoid the muscarinic effects, you titrate the neostigmine dose in such a way that you reduce the muscarinic effect as much as possible. Of course, with neostigmine, you're going to add antimuscarinics like glycopyrrolate and atropine.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Sir, what about holding or giving the pyridostigmine who is on
Okay, so
regular?
it is generally agreed that you can give the morning dose and need not stop. At least if you withdraw 4 to 6 hours before surgery, that is sufficient.
Okay, sir.
Sir, how does ACHE inhibitors overdose causes cholinergic crisis, sir?
ICSC inhibitor. Okay, what happened when the ACE inhibitor overdose? Okay, fine. So acetylcholine is metabolized by acetylcholine esterase. Okay, when you inhibit these drugs, like when you use neostigmine or pyridostigmine, you're blocking this one. So what happens to the acetylcholine? It goes up, right? When acetylcholine goes up, it is going to produce cholinergic symptoms. Treatment, atropine.
Yes.
Good. Let's move on to next station. Read the question. Who want to start? Volunteer. Lest others can keep quiet. Yeah.
I will volunteer.
Yes. Have you read the case?
Yes, sir.
What are the possible reasons?
Local anesthetic systemic
Okay, so
toxicity.
this is a local anesthetic systemic toxicity. Right. What are the signs of lust in a patient?
Perioral numbness.
Signs of
giddiness.
lust. Okay. Altered mental status. First thing, right? Altered mental status. Right. Any cardiovascular instability, predominantly, or seizures. So these are the main signs of local anesthetic toxicity. Perioral numbness comes at very low level of local anesthetic going into the body, right? Into the vascular circulation. What is the immediate management in lust?
Supportive treatments.
Okay.
Stop the inhalation.
A, B, C. So in RV, what do? You give 100% oxygen. If needed, you're gonna intubate the patient. Okay. What does you do in the breathing? Put him, ventilate, give 100% oxygen. Is there anything specific in the breathing?
It should not cause metabolic.
Should not cause why you are going to cause metabolic acidosis? So you have to hyperventilate the patient. Why? Hyperventilation is advised in a patient with local anesthetic systemic toxicity.
Cerebral vasoconstriction, sir.
Okay, because of that.
Sir, binding of the local anesthetics.
Sorry. Okay, no worries. Put your mics on mute. So by hyperventilating, what it's doing is in patient with an active seizure or local anesthetic systemic toxicity, they will have a severe metabolic acidosis in the tissues, right? So as a compensatory response to severe metabolic acidosis, you have to hyperventilate and produce respiratory alkalosis because patient has lost his compensatory response. So hyperventilate and try to control this metabolic acidosis level. First thing. Second thing, when you hyperventilate, you're producing cerebral vasoconstriction by inducing a respiratory alkalosis. Cerebral vasoconstriction reduces the amount of drug availability going and reaching the brain parenchyma. So that is how you can reduce the seizure. So these are the two ways why hyperventilation is working. Okay. Good. How do you manage?
Sorry, sir.
Sorry.
Could you please repeat, sir, just once?
Hyperventilation is a compensatory response because patient with seizures will have a severe metabolic acidosis. So in order to overcome the acidosis in the body, you have to hyperventilate. First reason. Second thing, by hyperventilation, you are producing respiratory alkalosis. That produces cerebral vasoconstriction. That reduces the amount of local anesthetic drug reaching the brain parenchyma. So these are the two purposes why you're giving the hyperventilation during breathing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. So in patients, right, local anesthetic, how does a local anesthetic work basically?
Binding to sodium channels.
Okay, it blocks the sodium channels. Perfect. Okay. When it blocks the sodium channels, what happens to the conduction?
Depolarization is prevented.
Prevented. So the conduction is going to get slow, right?
Yes, sir.
When the conduction is slowing down, why do you get seizures in local anesthetic toxicity? Because seizure is nothing but excessive electrical activity. Am I right?
Yes.
But why do you get seizures when the sodium channels are blocked by the local anesthetic?
There is decreased energy available for the cells.
So when there is decreased energy, they should sleep, right? They should not jump and dance.
Loss of inhibition in the skin.
Okay, so what happens, the local anesthetic predominantly blocks the inhibitory neurons first. Okay, the local anesthetic go and block the sodium channels, predominantly acts in the inhibitory neurons. So that is why when there is a balance in the excited and inhibitory neurons, you get a seizures. After a quite longer time, the excited neurons are also get inhibited, so that produces coma at the end. Okay, so that's the reason you get seizures first, then you get a comatose state. Good. How do you manage seizures now?
Anti-epileptics.
Don't tell some vague terms. Some say some drugs.
Benzodiazepines, midazolam.
Benzodiazepines like midazolam or lorazepam. Just all please mute, guys. Benzodiazepines like midazolam, lorazepam. You can use thiopentone. You can use propofol. Right? So these drugs you can use to manage the seizures. Right, fine. What is the definitive treatment?
Intralipid 20%.
20% intralipid. Okay, very good. So the dosage, how much to give, how many boluses, everything just remember. I don't know whether they'll ask in the exam or not, so don't worry. So treatment is 20% intralipid. What are the drugs has to be specifically avoided in managing cardiac arrest in this patient?
Etomidate.
Etomidate. Why?
Sir, lignocaine, sir.
Okay,
Lignocaine should be avoided. We can use amiodarone instead of lignocaine.
Please others be good. Just one alone, right? Lignocaine has to be avoided. Then what other drugs you have to avoid?
Phenytoin.
Phenytoin. Why? Is it given anywhere like that? No. Propofol.
Lithium.
Propofol for managing the cardiac arrest. Okay, propofol is not a substitute for lipid. So when there is no lipid, don't use propofol as a lipid. Okay, don't use propofol. Then calcium channel blockers. Calcium channel blockers should not be used to treat antiarrhythmia in patients with intralipid. Right? Calcium channel blockers is a powerful myocardial suppressant, so that prevents the patient's outcome. So don't use lidocaine for ventricular arrhythmias. Don't use propofol as a lipid substitute, and don't use calcium channel blockers for antiarrhythmia. Good. So these antiarrhythmic drugs we avoided, we discussed. What are the complications of giving 20% intralipid? Say, for example, you're given intralipid, you have assisted the patient. In the next 2 days, you have to look for one specific complication. What is that?
There can be pulmonary.
Sorry?
Pancreatitis.
Pancreatitis. Excellent. Pancreatitis. Okay, this intraperson intralipid can produce huge amount of lipid obstructing the minor circulation. So pancreatitis is one of the expected complications you have to watch in the next subsequent days. Good. Any questions in this station?
Sir, toxic doses of local anesthetics causing systemic toxicity, just revision.
Okay, I think the toxic dose is more than 5 milliequivalents, I think, for the more than 5 microgram concentration. So each concentration has got different complication. Like if it is going more than 25, you get cardiorespiratory arrest. Generally, tingling, numbness generally comes after between 5 to 10. And after more than 20 micrograms concentration, you get the cardiorespiratory arrest. Okay. Why?
So,
Yeah, tell me.
Aside the immediate management of circulation, it is said that the adrenaline dose has to be reduced.
Adrenaline dose has to be reduced, yes.
Why is that?
I mean, adrenaline dose, when you keep on giving adrenaline, what happens? Adrenaline, it reduces the coronary perfusion by reducing the diastolic time. Okay, it is a vasoconstrictor. It can constrict the coronary vessels. So that ultimately affects the perfusion to the heart.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Good. And how does the intralipid work?
Lipid sink phenomena, sir.
How does the intralipid work and how it is useful in local anesthetic toxicity?
Sir, because of the lipid sink phenomenon, it competitively binds the receptors where local anesthetic is going to block.
Okay, so lipid solubility or the lipid has got high affinity towards sodium channel. Okay, so it competitively binds, competes with the bupivacaine and binds with the sodium channel. So that's how it is displacing the bupivacaine from its attachment. Then second thing, it bupivacaine. You know how bupivacaine causes cardiac arrest? Why bupivacaine induced cardiac arrest takes longer time to dissociate from its attachment?
Because the binding is stronger than the other.
Longer duration of action of BP.
No, it is not a longer duration. Basically, it inhibits enzyme called acyl. It inhibits enzyme called acyl carnitine transferase. Okay, this is an important enzyme in fatty acid oxidation. So by inhibiting this enzyme, it reduces the availability of fatty acids for metabolism. So that is why it produces a very resistant cardiac arrest. Okay, by inhibiting this enzyme called acyl carnitine transferase, which is an important enzyme in the beta oxidation of fatty acids. Good. It's out of interest. Don't worry if you don't know that. No problem. Okay. Why lignocaine is acting more faster than bupivacaine?
The pKa is very near the pH.
Okay. So onset of local anesthetic action. What are the factors which determine the onset of local anesthetic action?
pKa, sir.
pKa. Then any other factor?
Lipid soluble.
No.
Lipid soluble. No.
No.
Myelination of the nerves, sir.
No.
Temperature.
Molecular weight.
Protein weight.
Molecular weight. Okay. So these are the two factors which will affect the onset of local anesthetic. Is there any law, you know, the onset of action in molecular weight governing any law? Graham's law of diffusion. Okay. Graham's law of diffusion. Graham's law of diffusion says diffusion is inversely proportional to the square root of molecular weight, which means smaller substance can diffuse across the membrane and act easily, right? That is Graham's law of diffusion. What are the factors which is going to affect the duration of local anesthetic?
Blood supply.
No.
Vasoconstrictor.
No.
Addition of vasoconstrictor.
Okay. Intrinsic vasoconstrictor ability.
Sir, pH of the body, sir, local tissue.
No. Protein binding. Lipid solubility. Okay. So these 5 factors are called as the physiochemical properties of local anesthetic, right? So of which pKa and molecular weight will determine the onset. The intrinsic vasoconstrictor ability, protein binding of the drug, and lipid solubility will affect the duration of local anesthetic. Only these 5 are called as the physiochemical properties of local anesthetic. And these 5 factors will determine whether the drug is going to act fast or is going to act longer or going to act for shorter duration. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good. Let's move on to next session. Right. Read this question. Who wants to start this one? Someone, can you remove the scribbling line for me? It's really disturbing. Read the question. Who want to start? Yeah, louder, please. I'm not able to hear you clearly. Your voice is very low, man. Increase your volume. We're not able to get you clearly.
Malignant hyperthermia, sir.
Very good. Okay. What are the features will tell you malignant hyperthermia, or in other terms, define malignant hyperthermia?
Malignant hyperthermia is a pharmacogenetic disorder which on whose triggering events are.
What are the 3 criteria to tell the patient is having malignant hyperthermia? Number 1, unexplained tachycardia. Okay. Number 2, unexplained increase in the end-tidal carbon dioxide concentration. And number 3, unexplained increase in mean oxygen consumption. So these are the 3 factors is essential criteria to tell that the patient is having malignant hyperthermia. Remember, temperature doesn't come as a part of diagnosis. Okay. Patient can still have a normothermia, and having all the 3 factors, it could be still be malignant hyperthermia. So unexplained tachycardia, unexplained increase in end-tidal carbon dioxide concentration, and unexplained increase in the oxygen consumption. Good. So what is the triggering factor in these patients? Or what are the normal triggering factor for malignant hypothermia?
Inhalational anesthetic.
Okay, inhalational agents, all inhalational agents, like from halothane, sevoflurane, desflurane, and isoflurane. Then
Choline.
Muscle relaxant, succinylcholine, succinylcholine. So these are the factors which is going to be the triggering factors for malignant hypothermia. And what is the triggering factor in this patient?
DMD, sir. muscular dystrophy.
Sevoflurane, okay? Sevoflurane is a triggering factor. DMD is one of the risk factor. Sevoflurane is going to be the triggering factor, right? Good. What is the immediate management?
Cut off the anesthetics.
Good. Stop giving the triggering agent. Stop anesthetic inhalation agents. Convert to TIVA, okay? Because the patient is under anesthesia, you'll have awareness. So convert to total intravenous anesthesia. Then remove the circuit, okay? Disconnect the circuit, remove the volatile agent from the circuit. If possible, you can ventilate with the Bain circuit with 100% oxygen, okay? Fourth thing, hyperventilate, right? You have to ventilate at least 20 breaths per minute because there is large amount of carbon dioxide produced, and in addition, there is going to be metabolic acidosis. So hyperventilate. So these are all the immediate treatment. What is the definitive treatment?
Dental.
Dantrolene, right? So dantrolene should be given 2 to 3 milligrams per kg bolus, right? Over 5 minutes. Then every 5 minutes, 1 milligram per kg. You can go up to maximum of 10 milligram per kg, okay? Targets, when do you stop? EtCO2 should be less than 6 kilopascal, or your temperature should be less than 38.5. Only when this target is reached, you have to stop giving dantrolene. Until that, give 2 to 3 milligram as a bolus. Then every 5 minutes, each and every 5 minutes, you have to give 1 milligram per kg as bolus continuously until you reach this target, like EtCO2 less than 6 kilopascal and temperature less than 38.5. Right. So apart from dantrolene, what are the important definitive treatment you have to give?
Correct acidosis.
No,
Potassium.
definitive treatment, I'm telling, I'm not talking about the complications, treatment. Surface cooling, right? So cool the patients completely, right? Give cold solution, give cold peritoneal wash if it's a laparotomy. So completely give very cold solution, switch off the external warmers. So cooling the patient and dantrolene are the main definitive treatment.
IV fluids, fast IV fluids.
Yeah, there are large amount of IV fluids because the patient is hypothermic and they're going to lose a lot of water, insensible water loss. So fluids, external surface cooling, and dantrolene are the main definitive treatments.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Yeah.
Sir, I have conducted one case of DMD where we removed all the inhalation, all the vaporizers from the machine. Completely, we avoided it.
Okay.
Can we do this surgery or any surgery in a DMD patient under TIVA, complete TIVA with endotracheal intubation?
Okay.
So,
I'm not able to get your question.
so sir, in that case, we completely avoided inhalation. We just removed all the vaporizers because it is a triggering agent.
Okay, see,
So
Duchenne muscular
inhalations were
dystrophy-
not used at all.
Okay, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it is not that you should not use, it is one of the risk factor. Not all patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy actually develop malignant hypothermia. So it is not that you need not use it. You can use it, right?
Can be done by propofol infusion.
It can be done under total intravenous anesthesia, TIVA. That is also good, but it is not a rule that in any patient with muscular dystrophy you should not use sevoflurane. It is not like that.
Okay.
What are the
Sir, because
complications?
the dantrolene is not available.
Yeah, of course. When it is not available, probably on a safer note, you can go for total intravenous anesthesia. Agreed.
Okay. Sir.
Good. What are the complications? Acidosis, first one. Management, 50 milliequivalents of soda bicarb. Second complication, hypokalemia. Because of the huge muscle injury. So treatment, insulin dextrose, right? 50 ml, 50% dextrose, add 10 units insulin. Third one is going to be rhabdomyolysis, myoglobinuria that result in renal failure. So myoglobinuria can result in renal failure. To avoid that, force alkaline diuresis. Try to maintain the urinary pH more than 7. Fourth complication, compartment syndrome. Okay. Fifth complication, you're going to have DIC. So treat with platelets and coagulation factors and cryoprecipitates. So these are the major complications which can develop in malignant hypothermia. Acidosis, hypokalemia, rhabdomyolysis induced renal failure, compartment syndrome, and PIC. Any questions here?
Sir, as you said, the diagnostic criteria are unexplained things, sir.
Yeah.
Actually, it is.
Sorry, unmute and ask me again.
Sir, as you said, the diagnostic criteria are unexplained things, sir.
Okay.
So to diagnose malignant hyperthermia, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. It will
It's a
take
diagnosis
time.
of exclusion. Okay. So you have to think of make the patient plain is good, see other factors, treatment the patient, manipulate your ventilator. That's why I mentioned, even after altering their minute ventilation, ventilator, it doesn't change much. That's what I mentioned this. And compliance is good. That's another important factor, which means the lung, everything is fine.
Just out of query, sir,
Yeah.
if this thing happens at the end of the surgery, just before extubation,
Yeah.
so how to proceed, sir? Means we don't have
Right.
a
So generally
center
it can
dental-
happen. It can happen anytime from the induction, even until 48 hours after anesthesia, right? So management is essentially going to be the same.
just before extubation.
Okay. Just before extubation, what do you think the treatment is going to change?
So what I think, sir, wait and watch.
Wait and watch.
Nothing.
Right?
Stop.
You know,
Stop the surgery.
Have you
Stop
ever
the triggering agent and wait. And when the
Okay.
tidal volume is enough, extubate.
Good, right? So first of all, have you ever witnessed malignant hypothermia once? You haven't, right?
I'm not sure, but one of the case.
Have you seen, right? I have this patient, this patient is a true patient, right? That is exactly a 9 years female patient where I operated in Ganga Hospital. That patient is he's not a muscular dystrophy. That patient came for growth rod application. That small girl went in for malignant hypothermia. It goes very acutely, okay, without control. Within 60 seconds or within 2 minutes, the ETCO2 will jump like nonsense. Okay, you can't control that. Okay, once the patient is developed malignant hypothermia, if you don't have dantrolene, the patient will die. The mortality rate is nearly 70 to 80% without dantrolene. Without dantrolene, the survival is noted to be very, very minimal. There are case reports where they manage without giving dantrolene, but it might be a milder form. But when the patient has got a full-fledged malignant hypothermia, 100% they will die without giving dantrolene. Luckily, we had 1 year back a patient with malignant hypothermia, young patient, 21 years patient came for shoulder arthroscopy. He died because of malignant hypothermia. At that point, the hospital procured dantrolene. So that saved this patient.
I can say, sir, when I experienced this, I was looking for CO2 absorber and all. Maybe that might be the malfunction and CO2 rise.
Yeah. So if the patient is recovering within minutes, it is not malignant hypothermia.
Okay, sir.
Good. Who wants to take up this station?
Right.
So I'll
Okay. So what's your clinical impression?
May I? So is it?
Yes,
Me?
Javed. Rashal, please put a mic. Yes, Javed. What is your clinical impression?
Diabetic ketoacidosis. Sir.
Okay, it is a diabetic ketoacidosis. Okay, can you read this ABG for me?
With severe metabolic acidosis.
Okay, anything else? It is a mixed disorder actually.
Yes.
Anyone wants to try it?
Yes.
People who have attended my ABG class may find it very easy, right? So who wants to interpret along with me?
So I'll go, sir.
Yeah.
So pH is on acidotic side.
pH is on the acidotic side. Good.
PCO2 is on alkalotic side.
Excellent.
And bicarb is on acidotic side.
So what's the primary
So
disorder?
It's a metabolic acidosis.
Okay, it's a metabolic acidosis. Very good. What is the expected compensation of PaCO2 in metabolic acidosis?
Expected will be 15 plus
15
bicarb.
plus 6. 15 plus 6. It should be 21. Okay.
21.
But what is this patient PaCO2?
30, sir.
So what do you mean by that?
So there will be some mixed disorder along with
Okay,
it.
what is additional mixed disorder here?
It will be respiratory alkalosis.
Acidosis. Okay, it is beyond the expected.
Acidosis, huh?
Okay, so it is
Yes.
going to be metabolic acidosis plus respiratory acidosis. Okay, fine. When you find the metabolic acidosis, what is the next thing you have to do?
Anion gaps are
Okay,
calculated.
calculate the anion gap here. It is going to be 132 minus 6 plus 100, right? So it is going to be 26, right? So what type of acidosis is this?
This is high anion.
Okay, say high anion gap metabolic acidosis. Okay, when there is high anion gap, what is the next thing you do?
We can calculate gap.
Okay, delta gap. What is the delta gap here? It is going to be 26 minus 12 divided by 24 minus 6, right?
Yes, sir.
So that is going to be 14 by 18, less than 1. So what do you mean by that?
Less than 1.
Normal.
So that patient is having additional normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. So the full ABG report is high anion gap metabolic acidosis plus respiratory acidosis plus a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, right? So this patient is having a high anion gap metabolic acidosis because of the accumulation of ketone bodies. So ketosis will produce high anion gap metabolic acidosis. Since the patient is having diarrhea, diarrhea will produce normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. He is having a normal anion gap. In addition, patient is found unconscious, which should have produced respiratory depression, and that is the reason for additional respiratory acidosis. Got it?
Yes,
sir. Respiratory alkalosis or acidosis?
It is acidosis.
Sir, CO2 is reduced.
See, what is your expected CAPA CO2 in this patient?
21.
21. It is beyond the expected range or not?
Okay, sir.
Good. What is the anion gap which I have calculated? It is 26. Few examples for non-anion gap acidosis. Stop.
Normal anion gap, sir?
Yeah.
Sir, it can be classified into hypokalemic or hyperkalemic.
Okay.
So hypokalemic, it can be due to GI loss of bicarbs like diarrhea, urethral.
Diarrhea, stenting, urethral diversion. Fine. I
Ileostomy.
hope you know all this lesions, renal tubular acidosis, blah, blah, blah. Right. What is the medical management of this patient?
Resuscitating with fluids.
What is the first thing you do?
Resuscitated fluids, sir.
Okay, so you have to give 0.9% normal saline, at least 1 liter per hour for initial 2 hours. That's the most important thing, right? Once you did a resuscitation, you have to send the baseline electrolytes and check for the potassium so that you can start with can decide whether to start insulin or not. Okay, what is the dose of insulin?
Sir, sorry to interrupt, but potassium already appears high. We should not give calcium gluconate here, sir.
Potassium is 5.8. What is the purpose of giving calcium gluconate?
Cardiac stability, prevent arrhythmia, sir.
Okay, it is prevents arrhythmia. You give calcium gluconate only when there is an ECG change. Okay, calcium gluconate is given only when there is a membrane irritability or when there is a ECG disturbances. When there is no ECG disturbances, don't give calcium gluconate. Okay, it is not needed.
So can it be, if the potassium is raised, is it possible that there will be no ECG change even the potassium is 5.8?
Still possible. Okay, still possible. I've seen patients even at 6 not having any ECG change.
Okay.
Right. So what is the dose of insulin?
0.1 unit per
1 unit per kg.
Okay, 0.1 units per kg per hour infusion. What is the target blood sugar you keep?
250.
Okay, try to keep more than 250. Don't acutely reduce below 250. Once it has come below 250, you can add some dextrose containing solution for fluid replacement. Okay, make sure you keep the potassium level between 3.3 to 5.5. So this is the target potassium level you have to keep. When the potassium is 3.3 at the beginning itself, don't start insulin. Give potassium correction and then start insulin. If the potassium is 5.5, you can increase the insulin dosage. Good. So insulin infusion, normal saline, give the fluid replacement. If the blood sugar is coming less than 250, add dextrose containing solutions. Once the resuscitation has been done, you can correct other abnormalities like phosphate correction and all those things.
Sir, sorry to interrupt you. Normal saline, how much?
So for the initial 1 to 2 hours, you have to give 1 liter, at least 1 liter per hour for initial 2 hours.
Okay,
Then
okay, sir.
subsequently, you can give 0.45% normal saline, okay, with 20 to 50 milliequivalents potassium added in it, plus insulin that can be given at a rate of 200 to, not insulin, 200 to 500 ml per hour. So the fluid deficit will be around 5 to 7 liters in a patient with DKA, of which the half should be replaced in the initial 12 hours. Remaining half should be replaced after 12 hours.
Sir, does urine output has any role in fluid management, sir?
Yes, of course, you have to monitor urine output, isn't it?
No, plus adding like urine
No,
output has the
patient,
targeted.
this
Is it
patient,
target?
this patient, has got a huge deficit, right? They will have a very, very high, huge
ఏదో
deficit.
చేయాలి కదా చదవాలా తిననన్నా వినాలి.
This patient has got extremely high, huge fluid deficit, right? So whatever the fluid you give, it takes a longer time to pick up the diuresis in this patient.
Sir, as the pH is 7, so soda bicarb should be given.
Okay, soda bicarb, as per the recent guidelines, if the pH is less than 6.9, then only you can give 50 to 100 millimoles of potassium. 7 and above, you need not give soda bicarb. Okay, good. Mention few long-acting.
And sir, sorry to interrupt. Like if the patient is hyperventilating, we should not intubate it, right? It is a
Yeah,
compulsory.
I mean, never intubate the patient. The patient is able to maintain his ventilation. You can keep him spontaneous as much as possible because you can easily gauge whether the patient is improving or not. So only when the patient Jesus is less than 8, patient is acutely hyperventilating, there is a CO2 retention, then you can give ventilate the patient. Otherwise, ventilation is not indicated in this type of patients. It is very good if you don't ventilate them because you can assess the response.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, what are the few long-acting insulins?
Degludec.
Yes.
Degludec.
Glargine, Detrimer. Glargine and Detrimer. Very good. Some of the short-acting, Glucosamine, Aspart, Lispro. Intermediate acting, NPH, and Isofen. These are some of the intermediate acting insulins. Good. Any question here? Okay, let's move on to next station. Read the question and tell me who wants to start.
Sir, may I start, sir?
Yeah.
Sir, probable diagnosis is post-dural puncture headache.
Post-dural puncture headache. What is the point which tells that this is a post-dural puncture headache? Very good.
Sir, headache specifically in the frontal and occipital region and postural change.
Okay, the postural changes is the more clinching point. Okay, headache can come anywhere in any patient, but this patient is typically postural related. Okay, so what is PDPH basically? What is the pathophysiology behind PDPH?
Sir, any inadvertent loss of CSF from the column, sir, like loss of CSF causing stretching of the brainstem and decrease CSF pressures.
Okay, so it's a decrease the CSF pressure into the intracranium that will produce this sagging in the brain. When the brain tends to sag, it will drag the durus, all the dural membrane. So that is how it is causing pain. Okay, predominantly in the frontal and occipital region. And the more importantly, it is a postural relation. Okay, lying down, you get better because they're equalizing the pressure in between the interthecal space in the spine as well as in the cranium. On sitting down, you create a negative pressure that is causing the pain. What are the most common cause of headache in the peripartum period?
Dehydration.
Dehydration.
No. Tension headache, right? Tension, stress headache, migraine. So tension, stress headache, and migraine headache. These are the very common headaches. Don't think that PDPH is very common, right? What are the risk factors for post-dural puncture headache?
Use of the large thick needles.
Okay, tell me some patient factors first.
Young
patient, right? Young patient, female patient, okay, pregnant patients, patients with low BMI, people who are dehydrated. So these are the patient-related risk factors. Okay. Then needle factors, large gauge needles, cutting needles, perpendicular orientation of the bevel. These are the needle-related factors. Okay. Anesthesia factors, inexperienced operator, multiple punctures. So these are the risk factors for post-dural puncture headache. Young female, pregnant patients, people who got a low BMI and dehydration. Needle factors is going to be large bore needles, cutting type of needles, and then people when you perpendicularly orient the bevel, because that is going to cut the fibers. And lastly, from the anesthesia factors, inexperience and multiple punctures. Good. What are the medical management of post-dural puncture headache?
Heavy fluids.
Okay.
And NSAIDs.
Okay, fluids, IV fluids, most important, bed rest.
Psychological counseling.
Psychological counseling. Okay, good. Well, let's add that also.
Caffeine.
NSAIDs, most importantly, caffeine. Okay, how caffeine works?
Cerebral vasoconstrictor.
It is a cerebral vasoconstrictor. Okay, so it blocks the phosphodiesterase enzyme, which produces the vasoconstriction. It prevents the metabolism of cyclic AMP. By increasing the availability of cyclic AMP, that increases the availability of calcium, and that produces cerebral vasoconstriction. Good. What is the definitive treatment of PDPH?
Epidural blood patch.
Okay, epidural blood patch. And PDPH, when normally patients develop PDPH symptoms?
After 48 hours, 24
Generally develops 48 to 72 hours. That's the time frame they develop PDPH. Epidural blood patch is the definitive treatment. So at which space you do epidural blood patch? Is it the same at the puncture level, or one level above, one level below?
Below the puncture site.
Okay, so it could be done at the site of the puncture site, or it could be one level below. Both are accepted. Okay, so two persons will be doing simultaneously. One person will be doing the epidural space. Once he reaches the epidural space, another person scrubbed up in a sterile manner takes a blood, and you can inject up to 10 to 20 ml of sterile blood is injected. Good. So after injection, how long? What is the next step you do? Make the patient lie supine. Okay, supine for 1 to 2 hours, not more than that. After 1 to 2 hours, you can mobilize the patient normally. Okay. If the patient is having any pain during injection, stop injecting. What is the hormone used and what is the nerve block used in the treatment of PDPH?
ACTH.
ACTH, very good. ACTH is the hormone used in the treatment of PDPH. And what are the nerve blocks available for treating PDPH?
Sphenopalatine nerve block.
Okay. Sphenopalatine ganglion block. Sphenopalatine ganglion block. Any other nerve block? Greater occipital nerve block. Greater occipital nerve block. These are the two recent blocks. Greater occipital nerve is the newer one. So these are two nerve blocks available for the treatment of post-dural puncture headache. Good. Any question?
So is it necessary to do a culture before using the epidural blood patch?
Ideally, they're saying that maybe if the patient is having any signs of infection like fever, leukocytosis, it is better to avoid that.
Any risk of epidural hematoma?
The risk of epidural hematoma, I've reviewed lectures, but there are very, very less reports of having epidural hematoma, because what they say is from 72 hours, okay, after 72 hours, all the clot is getting dislodged and they are washed away by the circulation. So the epidural hematoma or weakness secondary to epidural blood patch, there are very minimal reports reported, Doc. Good. Okay, another interesting station.
Sir, I have a doubt in epidural blood patch. Sir, when we inject at a lower level, so when blood enters CSF, how will it block the puncture at the upper level?
You're giving 20 ml, isn't it? It will ascend up.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Similar to what you give in epidural injection, right?
Okay, sir. Okay.
Okay then. Right. Treat the station and one can take up.
So supraglottic airway devices we can.
So, okay, what is the next step you do? That is the first question.
Was convert to face mask.
Face mask ventilation.
Good. First thing I have to do is convert to face mask ventilation, because in difficult airway, oxygenation and ventilation are the key factors, not intubation. So since the patient is desaturating, immediately you convert to face mask. Okay, after face mask, saturation will come to 100%. What is next?
Supraglottic airway device.
Okay, supraglottic airway device. Very good. So how many attempts of supraglottic airway device you can go?
3 attempts.
You can go for 2 attempts. Last attempt should be done only in the presence of an experienced person, right? So 2 + 1. Good. Now supraglottic airway device is kept. It has been successful. What do you do at this stage?
We will plan whether to proceed for surgery.
Plan to proceed the surgery.
This patient is come for strangulated hernia. We have to proceed or we have to wait?
Proceed to surgery.
You have to proceed. So what are the precautions you take to proceed? What is it now you do to proceed with the surgery?
Sir, can we continue on supraglottic airway GA?
Okay. In case if it is not, because it's an emergency laparotomy, risk of aspiration is very high.
Intubating.
Okay. Supraglottic airway device is placed. You have to continue, and risk of aspiration is very high. What do you do now?
Play a Rydell's tube and
intubation through supraglottic.
You can attempt intubation via the LMA, right? So intubation can be attempted with the fiber optic laryngoscope through the LMA and try to secure the tube. That is always safer. In case if it is not able to secure, of course, you can have a risk-benefit ratio. Since proceeding the surgery is important, you can continue with LMA with due precautions for preventing the aspiration. Right. Now, LMA has failed, right? Still, you're not able to ventilate and you found it unsuccessful after 2 attempts. And also you find you remove the LMA, you're ventilating. Now it is difficult to ventilate. What is next?
Muscle relaxation.
Again, face mask ventilate.
Okay, again, establish face mask ventilation. Again, establish face mask ventilation. Now you find that no ventilation and saturation is dropping to 70%.
So short acting muscle relaxant, sir.
Surgical procedure.
Surgical.
Okay, so you have to go for surgical procedure, right? So cannot intubate, cannot ventilate. Your LMA has failed, oxygenation has failed, intubation has failed, and finally mask ventilation has also failed. Now this is a point to convert to surgical approach. What are the important precautions you do before surgical approach? Make sure the patient is adequately paralyzed. That is very, very important. Okay. Before 2015, until 2015 DAS guidelines, what they told us, when you find a failure in LMA, reverse the patient and wake up the patient. That was the initial thought. Now the latest difficult airway guidelines still said you have a difficult mask ventilation only when you have an unparalyzed patients or people who are not paralyzed properly. So the current guidelines stresses more importance on give as much as propofol, make him as deep as possible, give adequate paralysis. Inadequate paralysis is one of the important cause for difficult mask ventilation. So adequate paralyze the patient. Since the availability of Sigmadex, the adequate paralysis is given a lot of importance when you go to difficult airway strategy. So before going to surgical airway, make sure the patient is adequately paralyzed. Right.
Sir, what is the required dose of rocuronium that can we give? First, we are giving 1.2 mg per kg as loading dose.
Okay, you can give another 10 or 20 milligram, like you do for conventional, isn't it?
Okay, sir.
Right.
But sir, for surgical access, muscle relaxation is least important.
Muscle is least important, but before getting into, make sure the patient doesn't move, right?
Okay, sir. So propofol, like knockdown,
propofol,
basically.
make the patient
should be knocked down.
Patient should not be knocked down because he should not feel awake, because he is paralyzed, but brain will get alert now.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So adequate paralysis, adequate sedation, right? Okay. How do you do surgical cricothyroidectomy?
Excuse me, sir.
Cricothyroid membrane through surgical access to cricothyroid.
Okay. Identify the cricothyroid membrane. Identify the cricothyroid membrane. Put a transverse incision. Okay. dip your blade into cricothyroid membrane and then rotate 90 degrees. Okay. After rotating 90 degrees, you can guide your bougie through the blade so that when you rotate, make sure the blade is facing the caudal line. The tip of the blade has to face the caudal line. So guide through the bougie along with the blade, then railroad a 6.5 size or a 6 size tracheostomy tube. That is how you do a surgical cricothyroidotomy. In case if the patient is obese, okay, not able to find the landmarks, what do you do?
Sir, ultrasound guided.
Ultrasound is very difficult.
Make a vertical incision of 8 to 10
Make a long vertical incision of 8 to 10 centimeter, then blindly dissect and then do the same procedure cricothyroidotomy. Okay, good. What is the recommended cricoid pressure in DAS guideline?
30 newtons.
Okay, 30 newtons for paralyzed patients and 10 newtons for awake patients. Okay, this is up with this station. Apart from this thing, go and learn any alteration in the pregnancy, learn extubation criteria, go and find what are the change in the COVID.
In the students, why do we don't have Sugamadex? Can we still do muscle relaxation to the patient?
Yeah, of course, you can give, but so having Sugamadex is very important. But I think now a few institutes have started procuring that. But this guideline came based upon mainly by the presence of Sugamadex.
Sir, dose of Sugamadex, sir?
In case if you don't have Sugamadex, you have to go with succinyl choline only. But having given rocuronium at the beginning, you are left with no other choice.
Dose of reversal, sir, Sugamadex?
Sugamadex, okay, if you are given just now, okay, if you are given just rocuronium, if you want to emergency reverse the patient, you have to give 16 milligram per kg. Okay. If you find one twitch in the neuromuscular monitoring, you can give 8 milligram per kg. If you find 2 or more twitches, okay. If you find 2 or more twitches in neuromuscular monitoring, you can give up to 2 to 4 milligram per kg of Sugamadex. With 16 milligram per kg, however deep the patient is, you can immediately reverse the patient.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good. Who wants to take up this station?
I will volunteer.
Okay. What's the clinical diagnosis?
It is a hyperthyroidism.
That is not a diagnosis.
Graves' disease.
Okay, Graves' disease. Okay, Graves' disease. Okay, ocular features are predominantly with Graves' disease, and reason I've discussed very detailed in thyroid case. Okay, so don't worry. Ocular signs, I think we discussed quite a lot in the thyroid case management. Can you tell me a few ocular signs?
Von Graffi's.
Von Graffi's. Okay, I hope you all know all the ocular signs. How to assess the intrathoracic swelling?
Pemberton sign.
Pemberton sign. Perfect. Good. I know you know what is Pemberton sign. Perfect. What is the element required for thyroid hormone synthesis?
Iodine.
Iodine. Lovely. What is the storage form of thyroid hormone? I'm moving fast because I've taught thyroid case discussion. That's why I'm moving this very fast. What is the storage of thyroid hormones?
In the thyroglobulin follicle, along with thyroglobulin.
Along with thyroglobulin is a storage form. It is stored as monohydrotyrosine and dihydrotyrosine. Name few drugs which prevents the peripheral conversion of T4 to T3.
Propyl thiouracil, amiodarone, and steroids.
Propyl thiouracil, amiodarone, dexamethasone, thiopentone, okay, propranolol, and the radioactive dye, iophthalmate. So these are drugs which prevents the peripheral conversion of T4 to T3. Propyl thiouracil, amiodarone, dexamethasone, thiopentone, propranolol, and iopamate, which is a dye. Good, excellent. So we had a very detailed discussion on thyroid. Any further things you want to learn about thyroid, you can go and see the thyroid case discussion. We discussed thyroid storm. Thyroid storm can come in your OSCE as one how to manage. And similarly, myxedema coma can also come, which was asked in the last time. So management of both things we discussed in the case discussion. Lovely. Any questions here?
No, sir.
Okay, moving on to the next station. Good. Another interesting session.
Endobronchial intubation, sir.
Very good. A possible reason could be? Endobronchial intubation. Why endobronchial intubation? What is making you to suspect endobronchial intubation?
One is poor entry on the left side immediately after the position change.
Immediately after the positioning, perfect, and
Trendelenburg.
poor air entry on the left side and Trendelenburg
Airway
position.
pressure.
Increased airway pressure and drop in the saturation. These are the 4 criteria to tell the patient is having endobronchial intubation. Okay, apart from endobronchial intubation, what other things can present like this?
Sir, spontaneous pneumothorax.
Okay, there can be, but pneumothorax, all right, pneumothorax is one possibility, or capnothorax, more importantly. Capnothorax can present like this. Excellent. Then
Venous air embolism.
Embolism.
Venous air embolism.
venous air embolism will not have drop in the complaints or increased airway pressure. Airway pressure will be up.
Bronchospasm.
Okay, yes, bronchospasm, tube kinking, anaphylaxis. Okay, all the things can present like this. How do you differentiate capnothorax from endobronchial intubation? Both will have a similar picture.
Sir, tamponade. Patient will be in tamponade in pneumo.
Clinically, we auscultate after giving Trendelenburg position. We confirm by auscultation. We look at the EtCO2 graph.
Okay. So in endobronchial intubation, EtCO2 goes up. Also in capnothorax, EtCO2 goes up. How do you differentiate?
The bilateral air entry will be reduced.
Okay, one possible reason accepted.
So
Bilateral
there
air
will
entry.
be a separate lung emptying on EtCO2, differential lung emptying, or
That is, I don't know how far you can appreciate. I haven't seen so far.
Sir, tachycardia and hypotension will be associated with
Pattern of EtCO2.
Okay, tachycardia, hypotension could still happen.
Pattern of the
even in
capnography.
Sorry?
Pattern of the capnography.
No, capnography will not tell anything.
Airway pressures?
Airway pressures will be elevated both in capnothorax and endobronchial intubation. Most important thing,
swelling and
there is,
crepitus.
yes, one possible bilateral air entry.
Hyperresonance.
Okay, bilateral air entry.
EtCO2 after reaching plateau phase.
Excellent. That's the most clinching point. Okay, when you do a laparoscopy, normally for the initial 15 minutes or 15 to 20 minutes, the EtCO2 goes up because it is absorbed from the peritoneal layer into the circulation. But after 15-20 minutes, the EtCO2 gets plateaued. Beyond the 20 minutes range or 30 minutes range, if you again find there is an increase in the carbon dioxide concentration, it is more likely that the patient is likely to have capnothorax. In addition, if you have these symptoms and the EtCO2 rising after a plateau phase of 20 minutes, patient is likely to have capnothorax. Carbon dioxide embolism, they'll have a paradox. They'll have an acute decrease in the end-tidal carbon dioxide concentration. Okay, good. What is the recommended intra-abdominal pressure?
12 to 15 mm hits.
12 to 15 mm.
Okay, 12 to 15 millimeters of mercury. Okay, beyond 15 or 18, you get compression of the IVC that produces venous pooling. Good. What are the complications of carbon dioxide pneumoperitoneum, starting from the cardiovascular system? Then, what happens in the CVS?
Hypertension.
Okay, it can produce tachycardia. It can produce hypertension. It can produce hypotension. It can increase the SVR. It can decrease the cardiac output. Okay, so these are the cardiovascular problems. It can increase the myocardial workload.
So will it predispose to more arrhythmias?
Yes, it can produce arrhythmia because in addition, peritoneal stretch itself can stimulate the vagus nerve and that can produce bradyarrhythmias. And also carbon dioxide can sensitize the adrenaline and that can cause arrhythmias. Okay, what happens in the respiratory system? As we discussed, endobronchial intubation possibility, capnothorax, carbon dioxide embolism. These are things which can happen in the, and airway edema can happen when you put them in the prolonged Trendelenburg position, airway edema. Right, what happens in the CNS?
Raised intracranial pressure.
Okay, in CNS, you have the increased intracranial pressure because of the cerebral vasodilatation, and also there can be increased
ocular pressure.
Intraocular pressure. Good possibility in CNS. Then in musculoskeletal.
Nerve injuries because of the position.
Yes, so nerve injuries, right? When you put a lithotomy posture, you can compress the common peroneal nerve and it can compress the femoral nerve at the thigh flexion side. So nerve injuries are quite common. Then exaggerated arm position can also injure the brachial plexus, right? So then compartment syndrome. When you put the patient lithotomy, compression of venous system at the level of thigh, can produce venous pooling in the lower limb, that can produce compartment syndrome, and it can produce rhabdomyolysis and incidence of
decreased urine output because of
coming to the point. Okay, venous pooling, DVT, rhabdomyolysis, and compartment syndrome in the musculoskeletal system. Coming to the GIT, it can reduce hepatic perfusion. It can produce gastrointestinal congestion. Coming to the renal system, it can produce oliguria because of reduced renal blood flow. So these are the effects of carbon dioxide hemoperitoneum inside.
Sir, hematologically nothing, sir.
Hematologically, what else could happen? Do you have read anything? If you read anything, you can let me know. Good. What are the reasons for shoulder pain in laparoscopic surgery? Deferred pain, no?
Diaphragmatic
Irritation of diaphragm.
Carbonic acid.
Air getting
good.
accumulated.
I've told in the class, I've told in the lecture also in the case discussion.
Carbonic acid.
It's going to be the carbon dioxide. Okay, it is going to be the carbon dioxide which reacts with the water in the peritoneal wall, in the moist surface. It reacts with the water in the moist surface of the diaphragm, base of the diaphragm. So that will produce carbonic acid and results in this carbonic acid will go and stimulate the phrenic nerve endings. So that is what is causing the shoulder pain in laparoscopic surgeries. Okay. What are the advantages and disadvantages of carbon dioxide hemoperitoneum?
Advantage, it does not support combustion,
Okay,
and it is
no
naturally
combustion.
eliminated.
Okay, naturally eliminated by lungs. Then highly soluble. So the incidence of embolism is very, very less. Then cost effective.
Colorless, sir. Visibility.
What is the advantage of being colorless? You're going to give it to your girlfriend? No, right? Cost effective. What are the disadvantages?
It can cause hypercarbia, sir.
It can cause hypercarbia. Very good. It can cause narcosis, right? It can cause
Arrhythmias.
acidosis. It can cause arrhythmias. Excellent. So these are simple disadvantages. Okay. What is the storage form of carbon dioxide? Is it a gas or a liquid?
Liquid.
Liquid. Very good. What is the critical temperature of carbon dioxide?
30
degrees. 30 degrees. Excellent. Good. So that is why it is storage in the liquid vapor form combination. Any other gas in the liquid form? Nitrous.
Nitrous
Okay.
oxide.
Wonderful. Last station for today. Who wants to take up this one? Okay, don't worry about the ABG interpretation. Find what are the possible reason for this ECG finding.
Sir, I'll volunteer.
Yeah.
So this is hyperkalemia. ECG showing hyperkalemic changes.
Okay, hyperkalemic changes. How do you tell hyperkalemic changes?
So we can see ST elevations.
ST elevation is not a hyperkalemic change. What are the hyperkalemic changes?
Tented T waves.
Please be quiet, otherwise.
Tented T waves, yes, sir. Tall tented T waves.
Tall tented T waves. Okay.
White
When do you say?
QR,
When
short
do you?
PR.
Westall, please be quiet. When do you say T waves are significant?
Sir?
When do you say it is a tall T wave? What is the criteria to tell it is a tall T wave? Because when the amplitude of T wave, okay, when the amplitude of T wave is more than 50% of the amplitude of R wave, then only it is called as the significant T wave or tall T waves. Okay, the amplitude of T wave should be more than 50% of the preceding R wave of the same complex. Do you got the point?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good. So tall T waves then?
So shortened PR, prolonged QT.
Prolonged PR interval. It is not shortened PR. Prolonged PR interval. Widened QRS complex. Doug, don't make mistake in these things. Okay. Tall T waves, prolonged PR, wide QRS complex, and goes very severe. You get loss of P wave.
Sine wave and
lastly sine wave pattern and ventricular fibrillation.
Yes.
In your last ASCII, they kept the sine wave pattern as an ECG abnormality in a patient with hyperkalemia. Okay, so the sine wave pattern is typically like this. It looks like a ventricular fibrillation, but it's actually called a sine wave pattern specific for hyperkalemia. Good. So how do you manage hyperkalemia?
So first of all, we'll start with calcium gluconate.
Okay, so any patient with ECG changes, definitely give calcium gluconate. No ECG changes, don't give calcium gluconate because calcium gluconate doesn't reduce potassium level. It only stabilizes the membrane. Okay, it's just a membrane stabilizer. Okay, what are the other, apart from calcium gluconate, what is the other source of calcium?
Calcium chloride.
which has got high amount of calcium.
Calcium chloride, thrice.
Okay, it has got
Thrice it
27
has.
millimoles. It has got 9 millimoles. Okay, so
Yes.
calcium gluconate you have to give over 20 minutes. Fine. Then 10 to
Sir,
20
so,
minutes.
yes, sir. So then sodium bicarbonate.
Okay. When do you give soda bicarbonate? When do you don't give soda bicarbonate?
pH 7.1.
Whenever.
Okay, only when hyperkalemia is associated with acidosis. Okay, hyperkalemia not associated with acidosis, don't give soda lime or soda bicarb. Okay.
So can you
Sorry.
please repeat?
Hyperkalemia associated with an acidosis, then only you give soda bicarb.
Okay, sir.
So what is the cutoff value of pH? 7.1?
Okay, less than 7.1. Less than 7.1.
7.1.
Okay, less than 7.1. Okay, then soda bicarb. What is the next treatment?
So then GI drip can be started.
Then
So
insulin
dextrose
dextrose
is-
infusion. Okay. Restral, please be quiet. How do you start insulin dextrose infusion?
Sir, 50 ml, 50% along with 10 units of insulin.
Okay, fine. So 50 ml, 50% dextrose, you're going to put 10 units insulin. Good. Then,
Yeah. Sir, beta 2 agonists.
okay, how soon does it act?
So 20 to 30 minutes takes around
Okay,
30 minutes.
It acts within 15-20 minutes. What is the maximum duration of action?
1 hour.
1 hour, yes.
No, 2 hours. Okay, it acts
2
for 2
hours.
hours. Peak effect comes at 30 minutes. It acts up to 2 hours, right? So after 2 hours, you have to repeat it. Then,
So beta 2 agonists can be given salbutamol.
drug name, salbutamol. Okay, salbutamol nebulization. And how soon does it act?
Sir, 30 to 40.
It acts within 15 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
And duration of action?
4 hours.
4 hours. Okay. So you have to repeat them every 6 hourly. Right. So salbutamol nebulization, soda bicarb, insulin dextrose infusion. Then,
Sir, diuresis can be done. Nothing else. And then potassium binders.
okay. What is the next important treatment? Okay. If all the things are failed, you can try for loop diuretics. Okay.
Yes, sir. Loop
Loop
diuretics.
diuretics. When that is failed, and final resort, hemodialysis.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And in addition, you can treat them with orally. If you put a rice tube, you can put them on potassium binding resins, but that takes at least minimum 8 to 10 hours to start working.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Apart from hyperkalemia, can you tell me other indications for hemodialysis?
Sir, hemodialysis, the renal failure, end-stage renal diseases, sir.
Okay, end-stage renal disease. More than end-stage renal disease is actually severe metabolic acidosis,
Yes.
severe uricemia, severe hyperkalemia, uremic encephalopathy, uremic pericarditis, and when that is resistant circulatory overload. These are the indications for hemodialysis.
Sir, can you please repeat once again, sir?
Severe hyperkalemia, severe acidosis, severe uricemia, patients with uremic encephalopathy and uremic pericarditis, and patients who have got circulatory overload resistant to medical management.
Okay, sir.
Good. That ends the day. Thank you very much. Any questions here?
Sir, do we have a class tomorrow, sir?
I don't know, mate. I need some time to prepare for the next set of questions.
Okay.